Please join me in giving a warm Wisconsin welcome to Professor Sherrilyn Ifill.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this very special day, and I want to first, of course, thank Jonathan Overby for extending the invitation to me. Many people want to own Dr. King's memory and claim him for their own. His words and his work have been appropriated by so many. It seems we often want to enlist Dr. King's memory to do battle in our own contemporary cultural, political, and economic wars. And I admit that I too wonder on occasion how Dr. King would respond to the great challenges of our day. Of course, we can never really know, but we have some clues, and it would be an insult to the 12 hard years of extraordinary work that constitutes Dr. King's legacy to this country to pretend that we don't know what he stood for. I don't think it's hard to imagine where Dr. King would have stood on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan once you've read his speech, Beyond Vietnam. Dr. King's decision to speak out against the war was personally difficult. There were many who counseled him against addressing this issue. They argued that he should stay in his lane and speak only about civil rights and not foreign policy. But Dr. King ultimately concluded that silence equals betrayal. And in fact, at the end of that speech, Dr. King concluded that war is an enemy of the poor because the resources used to amass war will be diverted from the critical, important needs of the poor who live in this country. I think we can imagine that Dr. King would have applauded the recent actions of the Department of Justice, who only 2 weeks ago settled its massive case against Countrywide Financial after it was revealed that the financial giant discriminated against more than 250,000 Black and Latino homeowners, offering subprime mortgages to minority borrowers who had the same financial profile as white borrowers who were offered prime loans. He would have stood with jurisdictions like the city of Baltimore that has sued Wells Fargo for its racial targeting of minority borrowers, selling black borrowers bad loans, where loan officers referred to their black clients as mud people. We know that Dr. King would have stood against these predatory practices because 2 years before his death, when Dr. King could have rested on his great victory in helping secure the passage of the Voting Rights Act, he chose to take on northern segregated housing. In 1966, he moved his family for 6 months into a squalid slum apartment on Chicago's West Side to learn what he did not know. And he participated in what he called one of the most violently received marches he ever participated in, a march against segregation in Cicero, Illinois, where he was pelted with rocks and stones and racial epithets. Indeed, just weeks before his death, Dr. King offered words of encouragement to civil rights leaders in this state who were actively fighting against housing segregation in the city of Milwaukee. We know that Dr. King would never have been quiet in the face of an America that incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country in the world. There are 2 million Americans in prison. The vast majority are African American and Latino, and the majority are incarcerated for non-violent drug offenses. Is it possible to imagine that Dr. King would not have encouraged us to go another way, to see incarceration as evidence of our moral, social, economic, and cultural failure, and as an indictment of our commitment to our children's future? Know that Dr. King would have been on the side of workers struggling to receive a fair wage and decent working conditions. Not because Dr. King was partisan. Dr. King famously said, "Both political parties have betrayed the cause of justice." We know this because Dr. King died in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had come to march in solidarity with the city's striking black sanitation workers. As part of his Poor People's Campaign, King had moved his attention from segregation and voting to the economic conditions of the country's most marginalized people. The Poor People's Campaign reflected King's growth and his willingness to adjust himself to the needs of the time. He was deeply concerned about the need for good jobs, especially for young people. He noted a year before his death that in many cities the rate of unemployment for Black youth was 30 to 40%. And he said, and I quote, "With most of their lives yet to live, the slamming of doors in their faces can be expected to induce rage and rebellion," close quote. What do we imagine Dr. King would have thought were the potential consequences of today's 50% unemployment figure for young African-American men in cities like Baltimore and Detroit and Milwaukee? We cannot pretend that Dr. King would have supported unlimited corporate greed or the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. Indeed, Dr. King's his own words, stand as a caution to those who elevate corporations, money, and property above the lives of people. In no uncertain terms, King stated, "I am aware," he said, "that there are many who wince at a distinction between property and persons, who hold both sacrosanct. My views are not so rigid. A life is sacred. Property is intended to serve life, and no matter how much we surround it with rights and respect, it has no personal being." And finally, I cannot pretend not to know how Dr. King, who fought against the poll tax and literacy tests, and who marched in Selma, would have responded to the assault on voting rights throughout the country. I can't help but know how Dr. King would have responded to onerous requirements that require the elderly and rural voters and minority voters and members of Native American tribes who lived on the reservation to have a government-issued photo ID to vote. I believe that Dr. King would have been engaged with all of